3 days before her wedding, Porsha Scott received a text that shattered her world. I deserve something better. Heartbroken and humiliated, she sought refuge in a quiet little cafe, never expecting to fall for the kind barista behind the counter. But Richard wasn't who he seemed. Beneath the simple apron and warm smile lay a secret that could change everything. Would she risk her heart again for a man hiding the truth? Or was she destined to repeat the mistakes of her past? Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The invitations lay scattered across the bed like fallen leaves, each envelope an echo of a future that no longer existed. The elegant calligraphy, once a source of excitement, now felt like a cruel taunt. Porsha Scott sat motionless, her fingers clutching the silky fabric of her robe, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen of her phone. The message stared back at her, cold and final. I deserve something better. The words cut deeper than she thought possible. It wasn't just the rejection, it was the bluntness, the absolute lack of hesitation. 3 days before her wedding, Anthony Coleman, the man she had once believed to be her perfect match, had discarded her with nothing more than a text. A slow, numb disbelief crept through her veins. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe he had panicked. Maybe he would come to his senses. Her trembling fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to type a reply, to demand an explanation. But deep down, she already knew. This was not a moment of weakness. It was a decision. Her gaze drifted to the corkboard beside her desk, where sketches of wedding dresses were pinned in neat rows. Swatches of fabric, delicate lace, and intricate beadwork, a reflection of months of dreaming and designing. She had poured her heart into creating the perfect dress for herself, every stitch woven with anticipation. Now, the gown hung in the corner of the room like a ghost, its ivory folds mocking her. Her mother's name flashed across the screen for the 4th time that evening. Porsha let the call ring out. She could already hear Maria Scott's voice, filled with worry and disappointment. What did you do? How could you let this happen? Her father, Martin, would be more pragmatic, perhaps even furious. He might try to salvage the arrangement, contact Anthony's family, demand an explanation. But there was no saving this. The wedding wasn't postponed, it was obliterated. A dry, humorless laugh escaped her lips. Just last week, she had been selecting floral arrangements. Just yesterday, she had been finalizing the seating chart. Now all of it was meaningless. The weight of it all crashed into her chest, and before she could stop herself, a sob racked her body. She curled into herself, gripping the bedsheets, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She had given so much to this relationship. She had believed in it, trusted it. And yet here she was alone, humiliated, unwanted. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Eventually, the tears dried, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache. The room, once a place of warmth and excitement, now felt suffocating. She needed to escape. Somewhere, anywhere that didn't smell like the perfume she had chosen for her wedding day. Dragging herself to the mirror, she stared at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, disheveled, exhausted, broken. But beneath the heartbreak, a flicker of something else stirred. Anger. Not just at Anthony, but at herself. At the way she had let him define her worth. At the way she had allowed her happiness to hinge on someone else's validation. She exhaled shakily and turned away. She wouldn't answer her mother's calls. She wouldn't wallow in self-pity. She would walk out of this apartment, breathe fresh air, and remind herself that she was still standing. Even if, right now, it felt like she was barely holding on. The streets of Miami buzzed with life, but Porsha felt like a ghost moving through the crowd. The city's usual warmth felt distant, its vibrancy a cruel contrast to the emptiness that had settled in her chest. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that she couldn't stay in her apartment, drowning in the remnants of a wedding that would never happen. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she turned onto a quieter street, lined with small, locally owned shops. The kind of street most people overlooked, the kind that felt untouched by the rush of the city. That was when she noticed it. A tiny cafe, nestled between a bookstore and a florist, with a wooden sign hanging above the door. The Range Cafe. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't one of those modern, glass-walled coffee shops with overpriced drinks and influencers posing by the windows. No, this place was different. A bit worn, but charming. The large bay window revealed a handful of wooden tables, warm yellow lighting, and a counter stacked with fresh pastries. Porsha hesitated at the door, inhaling the scent of freshly brewed coffee and something sweet, cinnamon maybe. The aroma curled around her like a comforting embrace. For the first time in days, something in her chest loosened. She stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled softly, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the space. There were only a few customers. An elderly man reading a newspaper, a young woman typing furiously on her laptop, and a couple sharing a quiet conversation over steaming mugs. It was peaceful, removed from the noise of the outside world. She approached the counter, glancing at the chalkboard menu. The options were simple: black coffee, lattes, teas, homemade pastries. Nothing extravagant. No $10 caramel macchiatos or trendy, seasonal concoctions. Just real coffee. "Good afternoon," a voice greeted her. She looked up and met the eyes of the barista behind the counter. He was tall, with a quiet confidence about him, his sleeves rolled up as he wiped his hands on a dish towel. His presence wasn't overbearing, but there was something steady about him. Someone who belonged in a place like this. "Hi," she managed, her voice slightly hoarse from disuse. She glanced at the menu again, realizing she hadn't even decided what she wanted. Just a coffee. Black. Coming right up." His movements were smooth, practiced. As he worked, she found herself studying him. Not in an obvious way, but with quiet curiosity. He wasn't like the men she was used to. Anthony and his colleagues had always been polished, refined, perfectly put together in designer suits. But this man had an effortless ease about him, as if he had nothing to prove to anyone. "You look like you could use a strong cup," he remarked, his tone light, but not intrusive. Porsha let out a short breath, not quite a laugh. "That obvious, huh? Only to someone who sees people come in here every day looking like they're carrying the weight of the world." He slid the cup toward her. "First one's on the house." She blinked, caught off guard. "You don't have to do that." "I know." He leaned against the counter, studying her with an expression that was neither pitying nor prying. Just understanding. "But sometimes, a free cup of coffee makes a day a little easier. And you look like you could use an easier day." She hesitated, then wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug, feeling the heat seep into her cold fingers. "Thanks," she murmured. "Name's Richard, by the way," he added. She looked up at him, considering whether to introduce herself. Saying her name out loud felt like acknowledging that she was still herself, that she hadn't completely unraveled. "Porsha." Richard nodded, as if tucking the name away for later. "Nice to meet you, Porsha." She took a sip of the coffee. It was rich, smooth, not bitter like the expensive blends Anthony used to buy. It was simple, honest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something other than heartbreak. She felt grounded. The Range Cafe became a refuge. At first, Porsha told herself she was only going back because the coffee was good, better than any overpriced latte she had ever had in sleek, modern cafes where people pretended to enjoy tiny, artistic swirls of foam. But deep down, she knew the truth. It was the way the cafe felt, the way it hummed with quiet life. It was the way it smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread, the way the wooden chairs creaked just slightly when she sat down, the way the bell above the door chimed like a tiny whisper of welcome. And if she was being completely honest with herself, it was the way Richard made her feel, steady, present, seen. She noticed things about him. The way he never rushed, even when the cafe got busy. The way he knew every regular customer by name. How he remembered not just their orders but small details about their lives. An older woman who always came in with a crossword puzzle? He set a fresh pencil by her plate before she even sat down. A college student who often buried himself in textbooks? A refill was already on the house before he could ask. Richard paid attention, and Porsha found herself wondering who had paid attention to him. She watched him move behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, arms dusted with a faint sheen of flour when he helped in the kitchen. He carried himself with ease, but there was something else beneath it. Something controlled, measured, like a man who had once lived by rules far stricter than those of a simple cafe. He never spoke about his past. She didn't either. One evening, she stayed late, long after most customers had left. The cafe was quiet now, the low hum of soft music floating through the air. Richard was cleaning up, his movements methodical as he wiped down the counters. She had meant to leave, but instead she lingered. "You run this place all on your own?" she asked, watching as he stacked plates in the kitchen window. Richard glanced at her, amused. "Not all on my own. Rosa helps with baking in the mornings. Miguel comes in on weekends. But yeah, mostly me." She raised an eyebrow. "And you just decided to open a cafe?" He smirked slightly, as if he knew exactly what she was getting at. "What? You don't think I look like the cafe-owning type?" "Not exactly." Porsha tilted her head, studying him. "You don't talk like a guy who's been running a coffee shop his whole life." He hesitated just briefly before responding, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "I used to do something else," he admitted, setting down a dish towel. "But it wasn't for me." That wasn't an answer. Porsha leaned forward slightly. "What did you do before?" Richard gave her a slow, knowing look. "You ask a lot of questions." She shrugged, taking a sip of her now-cold coffee. "I like to know who's making my coffee every day." He chuckled at that, but didn't offer any further details. Instead, he wiped his hands on the towel, moving to sit across from her at the counter. "You ever think about doing something else?" he asked. She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I see the way you sketch in that notebook of yours," he said, nodding toward the worn leather journal she always carried. "Designs, right?" Porsha glanced down at it, surprised. She had never shown him the sketches, never even mentioned them, yet somehow he had noticed. "I was a designer," she admitted. "Well, I wanted to be. I made my own wedding dress." Her voice tightened slightly at the mention of it. "Not that I needed it." Richard didn't say anything for a moment. Then, after a pause, he asked, "What happened?" She let out a soft breath, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Anthony, my ex, decided 3 days before the wedding that I wasn't enough for him." Silence settled between them. She expected pity, or maybe one of those generic "he doesn't deserve you" responses. But Richard didn't say any of that. Instead, he asked, "Do you still want to design?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know," she admitted. "I used to. But now I don't know." Richard studied her for a moment, then simply nodded, as if he understood something even she didn't. "Well," he said, pushing himself off the stool, "if you ever do, I'd like to see what you come up with." She watched him walk back behind the counter, her mind turning over his words. It was such a simple thing to say, and yet it stuck with her. She wanted to know more about Richard, who he was before this, why he left whatever life he had before, and why, despite owning a small cafe, he had a watch on his wrist that looked like it cost more than the entire shop. The days at the Range Cafe began to blend together, each morning carrying the same familiar warmth of fresh coffee, the soft murmur of regulars, and the quiet comfort of a place that asked for nothing but her presence. It had become her sanctuary, her escape from the noise of her old life, from the expectations that had once dictated every decision she made. She had spent years chasing perfection. The perfect relationship, the perfect career, the perfect wedding. But perfection had betrayed her. Here, in this tiny cafe with its scratched wooden counters and uneven chairs, she found something she hadn't even known she was searching for. Simplicity. And Richard. He was unlike anyone she had ever known. He never tried too hard. He never pushed for anything more than what she was willing to give. He never asked her questions she wasn't ready to answer, never filled the silence with meaningless words. And yet he noticed everything. The way she sighed when she was lost in thought. The way her fingers tapped absent-mindedly on the table when she was sketching. The way she stared at her phone, hesitating before answering calls from her mother. One evening, as the cafe wound down for the night, Porsha found herself lingering long after the last customers had left. The warm glow of the hanging lights cast soft shadows on the wooden floors. The scent of coffee and vanilla still clung to the air. Richard was wiping down the counter, moving with the same quiet focus he always had. "Need an extra hand?" she offered, setting down her empty mug. He glanced up, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You offering to work for free?" She shrugged. "You did give me free coffee on my first day." "That was 1 cup. He raised an eyebrow. "This is actual labor." "Fine. I'll work for tips," she shot back, rolling up her sleeves. Richard chuckled but didn't argue. He handed her a rag, nodding toward the tables. "All right, you're hired. Just don't break anything." She laughed, genuinely laughed, and it startled her how good it felt. She moved through the cafe, wiping down tables, stacking plates, falling into an easy rhythm beside him. It was strange how natural this felt. How right. At one point, she caught Richard watching her. Not in the way men usually looked at her. Not like Anthony had, as if she was some delicate thing meant to be admired. No, Richard's gaze was different. Curious. Thoughtful. As if he was trying to figure out what had brought her here, why she had stayed. "You're not bad at this," he said, leaning against the counter as she wiped down the last table. "I was a waitress in college," she admitted. "It's been a while, but I guess some things stick with you. Is that what you wanted to do?" She hesitated. "No. I wanted to design." Richard nodded as if he already knew. "So what happened?" She swallowed, looking down at the rag in her hands. "I got comfortable. I let someone else decide my future for me." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was understanding. "You ever think about doing it again?" he asked. She exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't know. Maybe." Richard studied her for a moment before reaching behind the counter. A few seconds later, he slid a small notebook across the counter toward her. She frowned, glancing down at it. "What's this?" "Sketchbook," he said simply. "Figured you might need one." She hesitated, fingers brushing over the leather cover. It was small, nothing fancy, but the gesture hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't like the expensive gifts Anthony used to buy when he wanted to impress her. It wasn't extravagant or showy. It was thoughtful. Porsha looked up at him, something unspoken passing between them. "Thank you," she said softly. Richard gave her a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Anytime." And in that moment, she realized something. She had spent so much of her life chasing grand, sweeping gestures. The kind of love that came in the form of diamonds and vacations and elaborate promises. But maybe love, real love, was in the small things. In quiet moments. In late-night conversations and shared laughter over closing shifts. Maybe love was in a simple notebook, handed to her by a man who saw her more clearly than anyone else ever had. The world had a cruel sense of timing. For weeks, Porsha had been breathing easier. The weight on her chest had lightened, even if just a little. The ache left behind by Anthony's betrayal still lingered, but it no longer consumed her. She had found a kind of peace at the Range Cafe, a rhythm to her days that made sense. A life that, while unexpected, was starting to feel like it belonged to her. And then Anthony showed up. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind where time moved slowly, and the cafe hummed with soft conversations and the gentle clinking of ceramic cups. Porsha was at her usual spot by the window, sketchbook open, pencil tapping absently against the page. The bell above the door chimed. She didn't look up at first. She was too focused on the unfinished lines of a dress she had been working on. But then she heard a voice. Familiar. Too familiar. "Porsha." Her body went rigid before her mind even caught up. The pencil stilled in her hand. A slow, dreadful weight settled in her stomach. She lifted her head, and there he was. Anthony Coleman stood in the doorway, looking every bit the man she had once imagined spending her life with. Perfectly tailored suit, expensive watch gleaming under the cafe lights, the same confident stance that had once made her heart race. He was exactly as she remembered him. But she was not the same woman he had left behind. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick, charged with everything that had been left unsaid. Then Anthony took a slow step toward her. "I've been looking for you," he said, as if that was something she should be grateful for. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to unclench her fists. "Why?" Anthony's expression softened, his gaze sweeping over her as if taking her in for the first time. "I made a mistake, Porsha. A mistake." The word tasted bitter in her mouth. She stared at him, waiting for the anger to rise, for the sting of his betrayal to return in full force. But all she felt was exhaustion. She set her pencil down, folding her hands over her sketchbook. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice eerily calm. "Is that what you're calling it?" Anthony sighed, the same effortless, charming gesture he always used when he wanted sympathy. "I was under a lot of pressure. My family, my career. I wasn't thinking clearly. But I've had time to reflect, and I realized I don't want a life without you." She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. 3 days before their wedding, he had sent her a text message, "I deserve something better." And now he was standing in front of her, asking her to believe that he had suddenly realized his mistake? She shook her head slowly. "Anthony, you didn't just wake up one morning and decide to leave me. You knew what you were doing, and you made it clear exactly what you thought of me." He flinched, guilt flashing across his face. "I was wrong." She tilted her head, studying him. "Or did something in your life not go according to plan?" His jaw tightened slightly, just for a moment. It was enough. That was it, wasn't it? He hadn't come back because he missed her. He had come back because someone had disappointed him. Because the perfect life he had abandoned her for wasn't quite as perfect as he had hoped. "I just want to talk," he tried again, voice gentler now. "Can we sit down?" Before she could respond, another voice cut in. "She's busy." "Richard." Porsha turned her head just as Richard stepped out from behind the counter, a dish towel still slung over his shoulder. His expression was unreadable, but there was something sharp in his eyes, something she had never seen before. Anthony turned, taking in the man standing in front of him. His brows furrowed slightly, as if finally noticing where he was. The warmth of the Range Cafe, the scent of fresh coffee, the quiet murmur of customers. His gaze flickered to Richard, assessing, calculating. "And you are?" Anthony asked, his voice laced with the kind of effortless arrogance that had always irritated her, even when she had loved him. Richard didn't smile. "The guy making sure she doesn't waste her time." The air between them shifted, thick with unspoken tension. Anthony let out a short breath, shaking his head. "Right. So this is what you've been doing? Hiding away in some little coffee shop." Porsha felt her fingers tighten around the edge of the table. There it was again, that condescending tone. The way Anthony dismissed anything that didn't fit into his perfectly curated world. "This coffee shop," she said slowly, "is the first place I've felt like myself in a long time." Anthony's expression faltered. He hadn't expected that. He had come here thinking she would be heartbroken, waiting for him to return, desperate for another chance. She wasn't. She stood up, tucking her sketchbook under her arm. "If you really regretted what you did, you wouldn't have waited until now to show up. And you wouldn't have come here acting like you can just walk back into my life." Anthony opened his mouth, but she shook her head. "I don't need an apology. I don't need closure. I just need you to leave." For the first time since she had known him, Anthony looked truly caught off guard. He glanced at Richard again, as if reassessing something. Then, with a tight nod, he stepped back. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "If that's what you want." And just like that, he turned and walked out the door. The bell above the entrance chimed one last time, and then he was gone. A long silence stretched between Porsha and Richard. She exhaled, running a hand through her hair, trying to shake off the weight of the moment. Richard leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Well, that was fun." She let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "Yeah, a real party." He studied her for a moment, as if checking to see if she was okay. She met his gaze, and for the first time in a long time, she felt steady. Anthony had been her past. But this was something new. Something real. And she wasn't going to let it slip away. The night air was thick with humidity, the scent of salt and pavement lingering in the breeze as Porsha walked down the quiet streets of Miami. It had been a long day at the Range Cafe, one of those oddly busy afternoons where the flow of customers never seemed to slow. Normally, she would be exhausted by now, but her thoughts were restless, circling the same question over and over again. Richard. For weeks, she had let herself be comfortable with the version of him she knew. The quiet, hard-working cafe owner. The man who noticed when she needed an extra shot of espresso before she even asked. The man who handed her a sketchbook without her ever telling him how much she missed designing. But something had always felt off. Not in a dangerous way. Not in a way that made her wary of him. But in a way that made her curious. Richard didn't talk about his past. Ever. And when he did, it was always vague, carefully crafted responses that revealed nothing. Most of the time, she let it go. After all, she wasn't exactly forthcoming about her own past either. But then there were the moments that made her pause. The effortless way he spoke with confidence, as if he had been trained to command a room. The way he calculated situations, measured people in an instant, never flustered, never caught off guard. And then there was the watch. She had noticed it weeks ago, barely peeking out from under his rolled-up sleeves. It was sleek, expensive, too expensive for a man who ran a struggling cafe. It wasn't just any high-end watch. It was the kind that wasn't simply bought, but inherited, passed down through generations of men who didn't worry about money because they had never needed to. Richard was hiding something. And tonight, she was going to find out what. She had only meant to clear her head after work. Maybe take a walk and shake off the tension that Anthony's visit had left behind. But as she strolled past the main streets, something in her gut told her to keep going. Her steps slowed when she spotted a familiar figure across the street. Richard. But he wasn't heading home. She watched as he stepped into the entrance of an upscale hotel, the kind that screamed exclusivity. High glass windows reflecting the city lights, a doorman standing at attention, guests walking in and out in tailored suits and designer dresses. Porsha hesitated. Maybe she was being ridiculous. Maybe he was just meeting a friend. Maybe she was overthinking it. But then she saw the way the staff reacted to him. The doorman didn't just nod at Richard. He opened the door for him with the kind of subtle deference reserved for someone important. Inside, a hotel manager greeted him with quiet recognition, his posture shifting as he spoke. No small talk. No questioning who Richard was. They knew him. Her stomach twisted. Richard wasn't just a cafe owner. He was someone else entirely. Before she could think, her feet were moving, carrying her across the street, through the lobby doors, and into the quiet opulence of the hotel. She kept her distance, staying back just enough to observe. Richard moved through the space like he belonged there. No hesitation, no uncertainty. He stepped into an elevator, and without thinking, she rushed forward, slipping inside just before the doors slid shut. He hadn't noticed her yet. The elevator was silent, only the soft hum of motion filling the space. Then, without turning, he spoke. "You following me, Porsha?" Her breath hitched. He didn't sound surprised. Slowly, he turned his head, meeting her gaze with that same unreadable expression he always wore when he was trying to decide how much to reveal. "Richard," she said carefully, "what are you doing here?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair before glancing at the glowing numbers on the panel. "I was hoping you wouldn't ask that." The elevator doors opened, and he stepped out. Porsha didn't hesitate. She followed. The hallway was lined with sleek, modern decor. Artwork worth more than her rent, soft lighting casting long shadows. Richard walked ahead, finally stopping in front of a door. He slid a key card through the lock, then turned to face her. "You really want to know?" he asked, voice quieter now. She lifted her chin. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." A long pause. Then he pushed open the door. The suite was nothing like she had expected. It wasn't flashy, not overly decorated with excessive wealth. It was minimal, clean. A large window overlooked the city, the skyline stretching endlessly into the distance. A single suitcase sat beside a desk, neatly packed, as if he could leave at any moment. She stepped inside slowly. Richard closed the door behind her. "For the record," he said, leaning against the desk, arms crossed, "I didn't lie to you." She scoffed. "That's debatable." He smirked slightly but didn't argue. Instead, he exhaled and ran a hand over his jaw. My full name is Richard Harrington. The name settled between them, unfamiliar but heavy. She waited. My family, they own a company. A big one. The kind that makes headlines. He shrugged. I was raised to take over, to be the next CEO, to keep the empire running. But that wasn't the life I wanted. She frowned. So you just walked away? Not exactly. His jaw tightened. Let's just say my father wasn't thrilled with my decision. When I told him I didn't want to run the company, he gave me a choice. Stay and do my duty, or leave and be cut off from everything. Her eyes widened slightly. And you chose this? A slow nod. I didn't want to be someone who lived in boardrooms, making soulless deals and pretending that money was the only thing that mattered. I wanted a real life. So I left. Porsha stared at him, processing. It explained so much. The way he carried himself, the way he never seemed truly rattled by anything. He hadn't just stepped away from privilege. He had walked away from a life most people would kill for. And instead, he had chosen the Range Cafe. This is why you never talk about your past, she murmured. He nodded. Because most people wouldn't understand. Silence stretched between them. Then finally, he asked, Do you? She took a slow breath, looking around the room again. The hotel, the suitcases, the way he still carried himself like a man who had once had the world at his feet. And yet, he had chosen something different. Something simpler. Something honest. I think, she said carefully, that you're still figuring out who you really are. Richard studied her for a moment, then nodded. Maybe. She exhaled, crossing her arms. So what now? Are you just going to keep running? His lips curved into a small, tired smile. I don't know. But I do know one thing. What's that? He stepped closer, his voice lower now, steadier. I stopped running the moment I met you. And just like that, everything changed. The night after Richard's confession was restless. Porsha lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her apartment, replaying every word he had said. Richard Harrington, heir to an empire, a man who had walked away from everything. It felt like something out of a novel, too unreal, too dramatic to be true. And yet it explained everything. The confidence in the way he spoke, the precision of his movements, the expensive watch he never talked about, the quiet authority in his eyes. He had been telling her half-truths this entire time. She wasn't sure if that made her angry, or if it made her afraid of what else she didn't know about him. The next morning, she avoided the Range Cafe. Not intentionally. At least, that's what she told herself. She just needed time. Needed to think. But thinking was dangerous because it led to overthinking. And overthinking led to doubt. How much of Richard had been real? Had the cafe just been an escape for him? A temporary game he played to feel normal before eventually returning to his rightful place among men who measured success in billion-dollar deals? Was she just a part of that escape? By noon, her mother called. Maria Scott never wasted time with pleasantries. Porsha, where have you been? She sighed, pressing her fingers against her temple. Good morning to you too, Mom. I just had lunch with Mrs. Coleman. The name sent a sharp jolt through her spine. Anthony's mother. Of course. Maria continued, her voice tight, urgent. She told me that Anthony regrets what happened. That he was caught up in the pressure of his career, but realizes now that he made a mistake. He still loves you, Porsha. A bitter laugh almost slipped out. Loves me? Mom, she said, trying to keep her voice even. He left me. 3 days before the wedding. Over text. Yes, and I agree that was horrible. But people make mistakes. He's willing to work things out. Porsha clenched her jaw. She knew exactly what her mother was doing. Maria Scott was a woman who had spent her entire life believing that love was secondary to stability. A woman who had married her father not for passion, but for security. And she wanted the same for Porsha. Mom, I just think, Maria interrupted, her tone measured, that maybe you should consider what's best for your future. Anthony can provide for you. He can give you a life of certainty. A life where you never have to worry. Porsha closed her eyes. There it was. The thing that had always been an unspoken rule in their family. Love was nice. But security? That was essential. Anthony had money. Power. A family name that carried weight. And Richard? Richard had walked away from all of that. Maria sighed, softening her tone. Porsha, just meet with him. One conversation. That's all I ask. The call ended before Porsha could respond. When she finally made her way to the cafe that evening, she wasn't sure what she was expecting. But when she stepped inside, she immediately sensed something was wrong. Richard stood behind the counter, but his usual calm demeanor was strained, his shoulders tense. A few customers were scattered around, but there was an unusual silence in the air. She approached cautiously. Hey! He looked up, and the moment their eyes met, she knew he had something to say. We need to talk, he said quietly. Her stomach tightened. Yeah, we do. But before either of them could continue, the cafe door swung open. Anthony, dressed in a crisp navy suit, looking every bit the polished businessman he was. He stepped inside like he owned the place, his eyes immediately locking onto Porsha. A few customers turned, sensing the shift in energy. Richard straightened slightly, his face unreadable. Anthony barely spared him a glance before focusing on Porsha. We should go somewhere private. She crossed her arms. We can talk here. His jaw twitched, clearly not thrilled at the idea, but he nodded. Fine. Richard didn't move from behind the counter, but Porsha could feel the weight of his presence. Watching. Waiting. Anthony exhaled sharply. I know you're upset with me, and you have every right to be. What I did. I was an idiot. I hurt you, and I regret it. She said nothing. He took a step closer. I want to fix this. I want us back. Richard's hand curled into a fist at his side. Anthony's gaze flickered to him, his mouth tightening slightly before he turned back to Porsha. I know about him. She stiffened. He's not who you think he is, Anthony said. I looked into him. Richard Harrington, heir to $1 billion company. But he didn't tell you that, did he? Silence. Richard didn't flinch. He just waited. Anthony scoffed. Of course he didn't. Because men like him? They play games. They pretend they're something they're not. But at the end of the day, he'll go back to his real life. And you? You'll be nothing but a memory. The words stung. Not because she believed them, but because she had thought them too. Her silence seemed to encourage Anthony. You don't have to be his temporary distraction, Porsha. You have a real future with me. One that's certain. Richard finally spoke. And what's certain about you, Anthony? His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. The fact that you walked away when things got tough? The fact that you only came back when you realized you weren't as happy as you thought? Anthony's jaw clenched. You don't know anything about us. Richard's gaze didn't waver. I know that Porsha deserves better than a man who sees her as an option. The cafe was silent. Porsha swallowed, her pulse pounding in her ears. Anthony's voice was sharp, controlled. At least I never lied to her about who I am. That hit its mark. Richard exhaled, his expression darkening. I never lied. I just didn't tell her everything. And when she asked, I told her the truth. Anthony turned back to Porsha. And do you believe him? Her chest ached. Did she? Richard had hidden his past. But Anthony had abandoned her. One had withheld the truth. The other had discarded it completely. Her fingers curled into a fist. And then she spoke. I don't trust either of you right now. Richard's expression flickered, but he nodded, as if he had expected it. Anthony, on the other hand, looked stunned. Porsha. She held up a hand. I need time. Alone. The weight of their gazes pressed against her as she turned and walked out the door, leaving both men behind. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't going to let anyone decide her future but herself. The streets of Miami stretched before her, alive with the sounds of a city that never truly slept. Cars rumbled over pavement, distant music pulsed from a bar down the street, and the scent of ocean air mixed with the lingering aroma of fresh espresso still clinging to her clothes. But inside, Porsha felt quiet. Still. She had walked away from both of them, Richard and Anthony, leaving behind a conversation that had been years in the making. And yet, the further she walked, the more the weight of it settled on her chest. She stopped near a small park, settling onto a wooden bench under the glow of a street lamp. Her fingers curled around the edge of the seat as she stared out at the city skyline, her mind racing. She had spent her entire life choosing what was expected of her, choosing the safe path, choosing the future that others told her was right. But for once, she needed to choose for herself. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, lost in thought. The sky deepened into a darker shade of navy, the stars struggling to peek through the light-polluted city. And then, as if pulled by something beyond logic, she found herself standing, walking, back toward the Range Cafe. By the time she reached it, the lights inside had dimmed, and the closed sign hung in the window. But she could see the faint glow of light from inside. He was still there. Her fingers hovered over the door handle for a moment before she took a breath and pushed inside. Richard looked up from where he stood behind the counter, his expression unreadable. The cafe was empty now, chairs stacked on tables, the lingering scent of cinnamon and coffee hanging in the air. "You're back," he said quietly. She nodded. "I had to think." Richard set down the rag he had been using to wipe the counter, giving her his full attention. "And," she hesitated, "I was angry at you." "I know," she exhaled. "But I was angry because I was scared." His brows furrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. She stepped further inside, her voice steady but soft. "When Anthony left me, it wasn't just about the wedding. It was about everything. My future, my stability, my entire sense of worth. And when I found out about your past, I started to wonder, what if I was just a temporary part of this life you've built? What if one day you wake up and decide to go back to it?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I won't. You say that now," she said carefully, searching his face. "But I needed to be sure. I needed to know that when you chose this life, this cafe, it wasn't just an escape." Richard exhaled slowly, stepping around the counter. He moved toward her, stopping just a foot away, close enough that she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself back. "I chose this," he said, voice low, steady. "Not because it was easy. Not because it was temporary. I chose this because I wanted something real. And then I met you." Her breath hitched. "You're right, Porsha," he continued, eyes searching hers. "I was still figuring out who I was. But the moment you walked into this cafe, I knew. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't lost. I had found something. Someone." Her heart pounded, her fingers twitching at her sides. "And if I asked you to prove it?" He didn't hesitate. "Tell me how." She swallowed hard, the final doubt clawing at her chest. "Stay." Richard blinked, taken aback. "Stay in this life," she clarified, voice barely above a whisper. "Not because you have to. Not because you've lost everything else. But because you want to." Richard took another step closer, and suddenly, the space between them was nothing. "I don't want anything else," he murmured. Her chest ached with the weight of his words, the truth in them settling deep in her bones. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she closed the final distance between them. Their lips met, and the world stilled. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was slow, intentional, a promise sealed in the quiet of a place that had become home. His hands found her waist, grounding her. She curled her fingers into the fabric of his shirt, holding on as if she had found something she wasn't willing to lose. When they finally pulled apart, Richard rested his forehead against hers, exhaling softly. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered. And for the first time in a long, long time, Porsha believed it. Because this time, she had chosen with her heart. And this time, she had chosen right. 6 months later, the Range Cafe was more alive than ever. The scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air as customers bustled in and out, laughter and quiet conversations mingling together. The once struggling cafe had become a staple of the neighborhood, a place where people lingered not just for the coffee, but for the warmth it offered. At the center of it all, Porsha stood behind the counter, carefully arranging a small display of pastries. A smile tugged at her lips as she adjusted the sign beside them. A simple but elegant chalkboard with the words, "Baked with Love," written in her careful script. The door chimed, and she looked up just as Richard walked in, rolling up his sleeves. He had stayed. Not because she had asked him to, Not because he had no other choice, but because this, the cafe, the life they had built together, was where he truly belonged. He leaned against the counter, watching her with that same quiet intensity that still made her heart skip a beat. "You look happy," he murmured. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, giving him a playful look. "That's because I am." And she was. For the first time in her life, she wasn't chasing an idea of happiness. She wasn't waiting for someone else to define her future. She had chosen this. She had chosen him. And she wouldn't change a thing. As Richard reached for her hand, fingers threading through hers, Porsha knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the ending. This was just the beginning. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.